Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome. My name is David Brashear. I'm the director of the Muscarelle Museum of Art, and thrilled to have you here with us tonight in a continuation of a great series that we've been making our way through this fall, really hitting that intersection where science and art meet. Just to tell you a little bit about what's going on for the rest of this semester, and especially over the course of the next couple of weeks. If you haven't been yet to one of our first Fridays, that's tomorrow night. The museum is open until 8 p.m. The cafe is open until 8 p.m. We have some fun activities, music, some art making workshops. So come and enjoy with us. It's a great time to come out and see your friends. Continuing in our exploration series this fall, we have a film that we're going to be showing next Thursday here at the museum, My Octopus Teacher. So we'll hope you'll come out to see that. We're going to do that here in the event hall in relatively comfortable chairs, but not lie flat like you might have in some of those really great new cinemas. I'm really thrilled to be able to announce the opening next Friday of our show Liquid Commonwealth that we've done in conjunction with the Department of Art and Art History and the Art History Component's curatorial class for this fall. It is a juried exhibition, invited artists to come and present works for consideration into the exhibition. The class, led by Professor Alan Braddock, worked through 777 submissions from artists across the Commonwealth, and the result is about 50 works being displayed in galleries 1, 2, and 3 that take a look at the importance of water in the daily life of Virginians. And that members opening will be next Friday, and then we'll be opening the exhibition beyond that starting on Saturday. And then one of our final special presentations this fall in the Muscarelle Explorations series, where we're investigating that intersection between the environment and art, will be the visit by the artist Sto Len, and he is going to be presenting a discussion entitled Reimagining the Hydro Commons, Ecological Art Practice as a Collaborative Movement, and that is going to be on Tuesday, November 18th. So tonight we're here for a different session, another session in our sequence of the Muscarelle Explorations, and we're going to be in conversation with Professor Alan Braddock. Professor Braddock is department chair this year in the Department of Art and Art History. He's the Ralph H. Wark Professor of Art History, Environmental Humanities, and American Studies. And Professor Braddock's teaching and research explore the history of American and global art, ecology, environmental justice, and animal studies. We're specifically going to be talking about the book that he co-authored and co-edited, Nature's Nation, American Art and Environment, that he wrote and edited in collaboration with Carl Cusero from Princeton University. So it was published in 2018, and Nature's Nation accompanied a traveling exhibition co-curated by Professor Braddock and Professor Cusero, winning 3 major awards, by the way: the Alfred H. Barr Jr. Award for Distinguished Catalog from the College Art Association, the Association of Art Museum Curators Award for Excellence, and the Association of American Publishers Prose Award for Best Art Exhibition Publication of the Year. So please join me in welcoming Professor Alan Braddock.
Thank you, David, for that gracious introduction. Thank you all for coming out on such a beautiful evening. The environment looks very nice today, so I appreciate you coming inside for this event. When David invited me to talk about this book, which is now 8 years old, I was kind of surprised. But it does kind of resonate with the events going on this fall in the Year of the Environment. I was surprised also because it's a very big book. Those of you who've held it in your hand know that it could serve as a very good doorstop. It's almost 500 pages long. I think one Amazon reviewer said, "It's dense, but worth the time," or something like that. It's kind of an academic book, but its ambition is to kind of rewrite American art history from the perspective of ecology and environmental history. And so while I fit into this series that the Muscarelle has been doing with some very interesting speakers, we had Courtney Madison, an artist, speak a few weeks ago, and then Xavier Cortada, another artist. Those people are making art, they're doing activism. I'm not doing those things, but I'm trying to change the field of art history so that it takes into consideration ecology and environmental history in a new way. So I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about the book, its structure, the exhibition that it was associated with, and then David and I will have a conversation about some of the details. There you see the cover of the book above, and then pictures of the three museum venues where the exhibition was shown in 2018 and 19. It began at the Princeton University Art Museum in the fall of 2018, and then it proceeded to the Peabody Essex Museum outside Boston, which is an interesting museum of kind of New England art and history, very interdisciplinary, befitting the exhibition's content. And then the exhibition closed at the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in Bentonville, Arkansas, which is rapidly becoming a kind of major center of American art and exhibitions, thanks to the fortune of Alice Walton of the Walmart Corporation. And there were a lot of questions about these venues. Some people said, "Why are you taking your exhibition to the Walmart Museum? That corporation does a lot of polluting," and et cetera, et cetera. We had to face off criticisms like that. And we were very happy to point out that not only does Walmart, sell more organic food than any corporation in America, but the curators there were extremely welcoming, and we were never asked to pull punches or change our story, and so it was delightful to work with them. Let me give you a little bit of background on me, just briefly, so that you can understand the context of this exhibition. For years, for about a quarter of a century now, I've been doing art history, teaching and writing and researching in art history, focusing on relationships between works of art and the environment. It began with a book on Thomas Eakins, the great realist painter from Philadelphia, known for his pictures of the people of Philadelphia, as well as the outdoor spaces, the environments of the Philadelphia region. And I pointed out in that book that despite his vaunted realism, he was very careful to avoid some of the uglier truths about Philadelphia, its industrial history, the pollution and whatnot. And so that book kind of provided a different perspective on that artist and the meaning of realism. The second book there is a co-edited volume titled A Keener Perception. It's really the first book in art history to bring together scholarship on art history and this idea of ecology. And it was on the strength of that book that my now friend Carl Kusserow from Princeton took an interest in my work and reached out to me about doing an exhibition at Princeton on American art and ecology. The third book is another edited collection titled A Green Country Town, about Philadelphia, its environmental history, and the cultural imagination. And so these are the kinds of things that I was publishing before working on the Nature's Nation project. Below you can see the titles of courses that I've taught at William & Mary over the years. a survey of art and ecology that is now a 2,000-year global survey of art and its relation to the environment. A seminar on art and environmental justice, which I'll be teaching in the spring, that looks at contemporary art in a variety of global contexts. How have artists imaginatively responded to environmental problems? And then more recently, I developed a course called the Environmental Humanities, an introduction, which is really reaching across disciplinary boundaries. And it's meant to start a conversation with students in literature and the arts and sciences and social sciences about how can we think creatively about environmental issues. Sadly, as department chair, I haven't been able to teach all these courses for the past couple of years, but I'm hoping to re-engage them in the not-too-distant future. My most recent book is this one, titled Implication, an Eco-Critical Dictionary for Art History, which was published entirely electronically as a gesture by Yale University Press to make publishing more eco-friendly. It's a very different kind of animal than the book that we'll talk about today. It digs deeply into a series of case studies, works of art and their relation to the environment in a kind of deeper historical perspective. So anyway, Nature's Nation, American Art and Environment, which I produced as part of an exhibition project at Princeton in 2018, but the germination of the project went all the way back to 2011 when my friend and colleague Carl Kusserow reached out to me. It took years to put this show together. When it culminated, it featured over 100 works of art, borrowed from more than 70 museums around the country. It was the largest and most expensive exhibition that Princeton University Art Museum had ever put on. It required complex negotiations with a lot of museums and a lot of writing. I think Princeton initially imagined a fairly short book, but Carl and I were very prolific, and it ended up being almost 500 pages long. But we were not the only authors in this book. It features essays by scholars not only in art history, but in environmental history and literature and indigenous studies. And this was a very intentional gesture on our part to kind of bring in a variety of voices so that we would not be the only arbiters of interpretation. And as we had more and more conversations with our curatorial colleagues at other institutions, we realized how necessary this was, especially bringing in indigenous people's voices. In a book about American art and environmental history, that was necessary because the environment is an essential component of the cosmology and spirituality of indigenous people across the continent. And I think you can see here at William & Mary, especially at the Muscarelle, a similar gesture of diversifying the collection, bringing in the work of indigenous artists to show a bigger version of America than the one that I was taught in grad school with a very sort of Eurocentric focus. And so we wanted to kind of honor that vision of diversity and breadth and multiple voices in putting together this exhibition and catalog. And it's not really a catalog. An exhibition catalog is typically a book that has entries on individual works of art with a few introductory essays. This book is in some ways a more ambitious effort to retell the whole history of American art, going back hundreds of years, and broadening the scope to show how artists have not only depicted the environment at different points in time, but how they have imagined better futures and more sustainable visions for the future. We start the book in a kind of confrontational way, I would say, by presenting one of the most influential works of art in producing early environmental consciousness in the United States. Thomas Moran's Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone of 1872, a monumental painting that's owned by the federal government today, which was commissioned and purchased by Congress in 1872 for what was then the astronomical sum of $10,000. And it was meant to commemorate and sanctify the creation of the first U.S. national park at Yellowstone. The creation of that park being a very important early gesture or moment in environmental conservation. But, and we recognize not only the beauty, but the power of this work of art and works like it to instill in Americans a desire to protect important places like Yellowstone. And the landscape genre, the artistic vocabulary of landscape painting, the astonishing explosion of colors and majestic vista that you see in this and other works like it of the 19th century make it clear that landscape painting was central to the evolution of an environmental consciousness, a modern environmental consciousness. But the more research that we did on this painting and the context of the parks and Thomas Moran and the federal expeditions that led to the creation of the park, the more we realized how complex the story was, more complex than the story that I had first been told about this. When we learned that indigenous people who had inhabited Yellowstone for millennia were forced out of that area by the federal government, by the U.S. Army, to make way for the park, to domesticate it for tourists to enjoy it, that is, American tourists. Indigenous people were not considered citizens of the United States at that time. We realized that we needed to kind of inflect the story of the parks and this kind of art by showing that while the aesthetics and the motives were very important to early environmental conservation itself had a kind of, had troubling aspects to it. And so we wanted to tell that bigger story. One telling detail in this picture showing two figures at the foreground on a precipice overlooking the valley. The man at the left is a white explorer, probably Ferdinand Hayden, who led an expedition to Yellowstone, helping to map it and lay claim to it for the federal government. He stands at left, reaching outward toward the park space, or what will become the park space. To his right is an indigenous person, not named, not identified, who actually has his back to the Yellowstone Canyon. And this was Thomas Moran's subtle gesture of indicating the different perspectives that he and other people of his community saw in these two communities. His community, Moran's community, the community of Ferdinand Hayden and the American government, saw Yellowstone as a place of aesthetic delight and spectacle. But Moran viewed the Native American man as unable to appreciate that and therefore turning his back to it. And so right here in this most important painting in the founding moment of American environmental conservation, you have this kind of dichotomy being drawn between communities. And as a way of kind of doing justice to the presence of indigenous people, we wanted to kind of point this out and invite indigenous scholars into our project and give them voices. We talk about how in news reports of that time, the newspapers told the story of the American conquest of the West, including spaces like Yellowstone. The military was sent in to chase them away, to chase the so-called hostile savages away so that it could be preserved. And in addition to giving voice to indigenous scholars as authors, co-authors of our book, we invited a number of indigenous artists to exhibit in the show, one of whom was Jean Quick-to-See Smith, whose mixed media work, Browning of America, you see here. She wrote for the catalog, wrote for the book, and lent works to the exhibition, including this one that shows the United States as a kind of map with starkly drawn boundaries, but the entire map is overwritten with indigenous symbols as a way of showing the historic and ongoing presence of indigenous people crossing the borders, crossing the boundaries, being part of the environment, the American environment. The exhibition was organized in 3 sections: colonization and empire, industrialization and conservation, and ecology and environmentalism. And as those section titles suggest, the exhibition project was meant to tell a story of the emergence of what we now think of as modern ecological consciousness, which is not the same as the environmental perspective of people in the past. And yet we saw glimmers and inklings of that modern consciousness in historical works of art. So we wanted to kind of tell that story and show that artists of the past had pointed to the future, but in their own ways that we needed to honor historically. So in colonization and empire, we included a number of works from the 17th century and the 18th century and the early 19th century that showed European Americans engaged in the process of colonizing North America and establishing what Thomas Jefferson and other early Americans called an empire of democracy. But as part of that process, they came in contact with indigenous people and enslaved Africans and other people who were part of the landscape all along through the process of that colonial settlement. And the works of art tell that story quite eloquently, if subtly. Many of these early colonial works of art try to present nature as a kind of orderly place that could be organized and understood through science and religion. For example, the work at left from the 16th century was produced by an artist who was the son of a Spanish conquistador and a Tlaxcalan indigenous woman from what is now Mexico. And learning about Catholicism in Mexican Spanish schools, this artist Diego de Valadez presented in this print at left a vision of the great chain of being, a kind of European Christian view of nature as a hierarchical organized system with God and the angels at the top, with echelons of beings below, humans, animals, stones, and then hell at the bottom. A very kind of stark, rigid, systematic way of understanding nature. And that kind of systematic, hierarchical way of viewing nature persisted well into the early 19th century in works of art like the one at right by a Philadelphia artist and scientist named Charles Wilson Peale, who established one of the first public museums in the United States in Philadelphia. in which he arranged specimens of American nature in an orderly system like the one you see at left. And so nature was a thing to be organized and explained in these early works of art. However, by the middle of the 19th century, new kinds of visions of nature began to emerge in works of art like these by John James Audubon, the great Franco-American ornithological artist who traveled around the United States for over a decade, studying and painting birds, shooting them and making pictures of them in the bush as their bodies decayed in front of him. And he made one of the greatest monuments of American art history of all, the Birds of America project of the 1820s and 30s. And in Audubon's work, you see this new kind of more romantic vision of nature as a dynamic place of violence and change, not order. You see close-up views of birds in midair, in flight, or at right, the Carolina parakeet, a species now extinct, whose extinction Audubon even foreshadowed with some of his comments about how farmers were shooting them too often and too much. And his work even makes these so-called animals quite alive and dynamic, almost like people with their visceral power and visual energy. One of them even looks out at us as we look at the work of art. This is a very different kind of vision of nature than the earlier colonial one of nature as an organized, orderly system in ranks. As I said, the book is not just a story that I and my co-curator have told, but it includes many voices. And one of the voices was a former student, was the voice of a former student of mine, Laura Turner-Igoe, who wrote a really interesting essay in the book about the materials of art and their environmental significance, beginning with early mahogany furniture and how it was imported from Jamaica, and its production was implicated in early deforestation of that island and the transformation of Jamaica into a series of sugar plantations, and on and on and on. And through Laura's essay, a whole new story of American art history was opened up, paying attention to where artists get their materials. And in addition to mahogany, she talked about marble and lead white paint and turpentine and the complex environmental histories those materials entail. In Industrialization and Conservation, the second section of the book and the exhibition, we explore this interesting dichotomy between the emergence of modern industrialism in the 19th century in America and its devastating environmental effects, and how that went hand in hand with the emergence of an early environmental conservation movement, a glimpse of which we saw in Thomas Moran's Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. And one of my favorite works of the exhibition, this tiny painting by a Pittsburgh artist named David Gilmore Blythe, barely a foot in height, he shows us the beginning of the petroleum industry in the United States. In 1859, enormous reserves of petroleum were discovered and extracted for the first time in western Pennsylvania and parts of West Virginia. And Blythe, being from that part of the country, knew what that industry was doing to the landscape already in the 19th century. So he shows us this kind of drifter figure, who's probably a self-portrait of the artist, holding a jug of liquor and all the possessions that he has over his shoulder, and a bag of worthless greenbacks, because the inflation that is being caused by the new industry is altering the economic landscape as well as the environmental landscape. And he stares at signs advertising new opportunities for petroleum extraction. Meanwhile, the landscape in the background shows oil derricks and smoke and environmental devastation. So this is a very, very rare early environmental critique offered by an artist. Most artists were happy to celebrate the new industries of the 19th century, but here we see one of these sort of glimmers or inklings of a kind of modern environmental consciousness that would come full force in the 19th century. Other artists gave us a glimpse of an emerging industrialization of agriculture, here in the form of large-scale cotton production and the workers that were typically hired to work those fields. Winslow Homer's Cotton Pickers of 1876 shows two Black American women working in this endless field of cotton. A gorgeously painted picture that evokes Impressionism, French Impressionism of the time, but recasts it in the American context to tell us not just a story of nature's beauty, but of the environmental and social realities of modern agriculture and the people who are typically laboring under those conditions. I showed you this earlier, Thomas Moran's Western Park at Yellowstone. But it's interesting to note that another aspect of the emerging environmental conservation movement in the United States at this time was in the form of urban parks, like Central Park in New York City, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux, an effort to kind of bring nature to the metropolis, to preserve open space and clean air, and to make for a kind of commons where Americans of different backgrounds and classes could mingle and interact. Olmsted saw this as a way to not only make the city livable in an environmental sense, but to preserve American democracy and to bring Americans together, even of different backgrounds. And whenever I teach Central Park in my art and ecology class, students are often surprised to learn that Olmsted and Vaux, or Vaux as he called his name, literally dynamited, acres of land, hectares of land to build the park, creating enormous hydraulic systems that sustain the ponds and waterways, planting thousands of trees, and altering the landscape in order to create a nature in the city. And this, too, tells us something about the complexity of art and environment, because it's a very artistic creation, this nature in the city. And it's an indication of how we need to look at that word nature carefully and understand how sometimes the things that we regard as a pristine nature are actually a constructed nature. Finally, the last section of the exhibition and the book is called Ecology and Environmentalism, and it shines a light on 20th and 21st century works of art that are explicit and conscious in their expression of environmentalist sensitivity and sensibility. The word ecology had not existed until 1867 or 1866, 67, when a German scientist named Ernst Haeckel coined the term in a book that was not read by many people. And it wasn't until the 20th century that the term ecology and its meaning gained currency in the public sphere. And it's not surprising then that by the 20th century, artists are taking it up as an idea and using it to shine a light on environmental problems that they see, and also to shine a light on the beautiful things in our world that are worth preserving. And so you see the beginning of a kind of environmental activism in art. And here, my co-curator and I wanted to be careful not to just turn art into a kind of political statement, even though there's plenty of art that's that way. We wanted to maintain attention, or keep our eyes on the form of art itself and the way in which artists creatively used beauty and form to make their statements. And so we were very interested in works that used traditional media like painting, but did so in new ways to draw attention to new issues and new concerns. The biggest environmental disaster in America of the 20th century was the Dust Bowl that happened in the Western Plains during the 1930s, when a series of historic droughts coincided with the emergence of a new kind of mechanized industrial agriculture and the planting of certain kinds of crops that were not well suited to the Western Plains, like corn and wheat. And as a result of this combination of factors, millions of tons of topsoil in the plains literally blew into the air and disintegrated farms, forcing thousands of Americans into poverty and migration. The dust reached as far east as Washington, D.C. when Congress was debating what to do about this problem. My mother, who grew up in Iowa, remembered during the 1940s, late 30s and 40s, dust gathering on the windowsill of her small home in northwest Iowa as an indication of just how pervasive this issue was. And Alexander Hogue was one of a number of artists who used his medium of art, in this case painting, to grapple with the magnitude of that disaster and to, in a way, scare us into recognizing that something needed to be done. And he may have been the person who coined the word Dust Bowl. My research into that term hit a dead end in about 1936 using dictionaries and textual sources. But here's this painting from 1933 with the title Dust Bowl as an indication of how innovative and in advance of other forms of thought artists can be. An even more striking work by Hogue on the subject of the Dust Bowl appears in his work, The Crucified Land, where he again showed us a damaged landscape, a landscape damaged by drought and by unwise agriculture, industrialized, mechanized agriculture, rows and rows of crops that were arranged in such a way that the wind could blow the dust away. He merges that vision with a kind of Christian sense of moral outrage by showing a scarecrow in the shape of a crucifix. And the idea being that the land itself has been crucified by unwise agriculture and by this disaster. The exhibition included a wide range of media, not just paintings, not just sculpture, but photographs, decorative arts, weavings, art in a variety of media. And that provided us an opportunity to compare media around certain sorts of issues, like Hogue's painterly vision of the Dust Bowl and Dorothea Lange's photographic documentation of it for the US government's Farm Security Administration, one of the New Deal agencies established by Franklin Delano Roosevelt as a way of combating the disaster. And here in this I think, amazing photograph. Lang reduces the meaning of the Dust Bowl and its effects on the land and the people to the most simple forms you could imagine. The furrows of a dead field reduced to dust, and an empty house vacated by a farmer who could no longer afford to pay his mortgage because of these conditions. And here you see, I think, how both of these artists, Hoag and Lang, bring an artist's eye to kind of reduce a condition, environmental and economic condition, to its essentials. The story of the exhibition is not just, and here you see Dorothea Lang's most famous photograph of migrant mother, the kind of humanistic version of the tractored out photo you see on the right. If this is what happens to the land at the right, at left is what happens to the people. The story of this period of modern dawning, awakening environmental consciousness in art is not just one of horror, however. It's often one of extraordinary beauty and innovation, an example of which you see here in this just bewilderingly disorienting painting by Georgia O'Keeffe, showing a view up into the canopy of a pine tree, a ponderosa pine tree that she knew in New Mexico, on the property of a poet, a British poet she knew, a poet and writer, D.H. Lawrence, whose work she greatly admired. She never met him, but she went to where he lived in a kind of homage to him and made this picture of his tree. And while this isn't a work that screams ecological consciousness, we wanted to include this kind of work because it, in its very disorientation of our perceptions, it forces us to see nature in a new way and to recognize how, in this case, how a tree is maybe close to us, something even connected to us. Note how she represents the branches almost like arteries reaching up from our own body into the sky. O'Keeffe was a master of connecting us to nature, and that too, I think, is an environmental story worth telling. Other artists, as I mentioned, were much more sort of explicit and activist in their ecological perspective. Robert Rauschenberg making posters for Earth Day in 1970. Other artists like Robert Smithson, part of the land art movement, used the earth itself as a medium to make monumental sculptures like the spiral jetty in the Great Salt Lake. A work, by the way, once surrounded by water, is now surrounded by dry land, making it a kind of barometer of climate change, something that Smithson could not have imagined himself, but I think he would have been, pleased by this development, at least the relevance of his work to helping us understand the meaning of climate change and global warming. And I'll finish with this work, bringing the story full circle back to indigenous culture by pointing out a very recent contemporary work by one of the most prominent contemporary indigenous artists today, Chanupa Hanska-Luger, who was very involved with the Standing Rock water protectors demonstrations in the Dakotas several years ago, when he and his community were concerned about the implications of oil drilling in their vicinity. And so he created these so-called mirror shields to reflect the image of the images of the police and the military who are trying to contain them, as a way of connecting them to his community and making them reflexively see themselves in the very environment that they were policing. Anyway, the show and the book, as David said, were well received. all the reviews of the exhibition, I'm very gratified to say, were positive, except for one in the Wall Street Journal that described it as woke, but I can live with that. Anyway, I think I've taken too much time, and I'll let David come up and have a conversation with me now.
Great. Well, Alan, thank you very much for that really nice overview of the book. And what I want to say about the book as well, if you haven't seen it in person yet, is that it really is what one would hope to have as a backdrop to an exhibition. It's one that goes so deeply into what you're trying to communicate. And really, typically, for curators, an exhibition is typically just a visual show, a visual impact. But what you're really trying to communicate through an exhibition is the kind of material that's in this really dense and thick and informative volume. So thank you for putting this together, for working so hard on both of these projects. I only wish I had seen the exhibition, but I'm getting a chance to see it through this, as you mentioned, really a non-traditional kind of catalog for an exhibition. So here, I want to start with a question, and you're not going to be surprised by this. You use this term in the book, but I think not everybody understands this term. Can you tell us a little bit about the meaning of the Anthropocene?
Oh, the Anthropocene, yeah. That's a very important term, referring to the basic idea that human beings are now the driving force of change on the planet. The geological terms, Holocene and all the ones before, refer to phases of the Earth's development that are, in a sense, natural in their evolution. Anthropocene is meant to refer to a new kind of geological epoch in which human beings are the cause of change. And the reason it has come about, and geologists are still debating its legitimacy, actually, but it's gained currency beyond the world of geology in the world of culture today. And it's because the fingerprints of human beings are literally everywhere, from the bottom of the ocean to all of those, Elon Musk satellites circling the Earth to give us Starlink and whatnot, and beyond. And that pervasive signature of human presence suggests to many that we have entered a new era in which human beings are basically remaking the planet. And that's why in the book, early in the introduction, I suggest that we can use that term to think of planet Earth as a work of art that human beings are creating or recreating. And while that's a scary prospect in many ways, it also tells us that we're the ones who can fix the problem. And the artists who are pictured throughout this exhibition and book are giving us cues on how to do that.
So I'll invite everybody, if you don't have the opportunity to consume the entire book, which may be a year-long endeavor, that you might want to consider reading the introduction written by Alan and Carl, which is really a beautiful 35 or 40 page overview of what they were hoping to accomplish. And I have to say, I love, and we went through this a little bit in your presentation, I love that you start with the 1871 Federal Survey of the Greater Yellowstone region by the geologist Ferdinand Hayden, and the fact that the painter Thomas Moran, the photographer William Henry Jackson, and the watercolorist Henry Wood Elliott were invited to accompany the survey team, and that their art became a part of the government report by Hayden, which was used to lobby Congress in favor of establishing the park. So there's a lot to sort of learn from that and unpack. And we talked a little bit about the monumentality of the painting, Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, that Moran produced based on sketches after he returned east, but sketches he had made while he was on the expedition. And talking about that and you refer to this in the book as sort of a delving into the sublime, and it's parallel with European Romanticism and their obsession really with the concept of the sublime. I thought you raised a really interesting question in that section, and you said, essentially, does Moran's work, this one and others like it, Bierstadt paintings as well, create a line of thinking that essentially endangers less monumental landscapes as maybe not worthy of protection? If they're not this grand, maybe they're available for development or extraction or whatever.
That's an idea that's a little hard to wrap your head around, but when I read this very important essay by an environmental historian named William Cronin called The Trouble with Wilderness, I began to understand that by prizing places like Yellowstone and Yosemite as envisioning our true idea of nature, we kind of we put all of our effort to protect on those places without paying enough attention perhaps to the places in which we live, whether that's the city or the suburbs or other places that aren't as majestic. And by pointing this out, I'm not suggesting that we need to kind of ignore the parks, especially now when they're understaffed and underfunded. But the point is rather that we need to think of all of our places, even the ordinary, mundane places, as worthy of protection. And so I hope that that's part of the takeaway from that discussion.
And I think it was. One of the things I also love about the description that you give about this painting is the contrast between the European American look and digestion of this monumental landscape, and then, of course, the dismissal of the Native American, the indigenous perception of this space, when in reality, we know now, maybe not fully understood then, that there was a reverence in the Native community far above what the reverence of the European-based originated community would have been. I mean, these were sacred places that were believed to have come from the greater being, and they were important stewards as humans to these great grand spaces. I also loved in that section that you introduced the painting by the African-American painter Grafton Tyler Brown as also one that contributes to the pictorial documentation of Yellowstone in his 1890 painting, View of the Lower Falls, Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. We're fascinated at the Muscarelle by a couple of handfuls, at the most, of African-American male painters in the late 19th century who really were, in a difficult time for African-Americans, obviously, embraced by the broader community as artists of importance. So we're focused at the Muscarelle on, and he was a new name to us, honestly, but we're focused on accessing works by Edward Bannister and Robert Duncanson. And I'm really pleased to announce that we just recently purchased a still life painting by Charles Ethan Porter.
Oh, great.
And, you know, of course, we have that beautiful painting upstairs by Henry Ossawa Tanner, but these are, you know, 5 of the names among a very small subset of American artists at that moment in time who happened to be African American. So thank you for pointing that image out. It was really great to see. Yeah,
Bannister is another great artist. I was doing research on him in connection with my implication book that features a whole chapter on him. And I went to Providence, Rhode Island to see many of his works because he lived there, and RISD and some other museums have a number of his works. And I think learning about him gave me a new appreciation of the environment and of the role of art in relation to it, because he was a plein air painter in the sort of Barbizon school mode of French artists who would go out into the outdoors to paint in the open air. But for a black man to do that in 19th century America meant something very different from what it meant for a white artist. He could be viewed as unwelcome in many places in 19th century America, and yet he insisted on going out and making paintings over and over and over again. And just the sheer existence of those paintings is a testament to his courage. And they also express, I think, an early example of what we call environmental justice, the right to public space. And to have an artist doing that, I think, is very special.
Yeah, fascinating. In your chapter, Icon of Extinction and Resilience, I wanted to just maybe get you to talk about this a little bit, because it really helped to frame for me what artists were able to do as they confronted some of the great, great changes that were happening in the second half of the 19th century. And you go through a sequence of artworks that artists are essentially pointing out the destruction of the great North American creature, the buffalo, the bison, and showing that destruction. George Catlin's Dying Buffalo, shot with an arrow, from 1832 and 33. Henry Worrell's Wanton Destruction of Buffalo from 1872. Thomas Nast's The Last Buffalo of 1874. And just reports that were published. And then James Henry Moser's Still Hunt and Where the Millions Have Gone from 1888. Can you just talk a little bit about the importance of that artistic, I mean, I think we might call it artistic activism, specifically related to that issue?
Definitely. I didn't show those because in this presentation, because they can be difficult to look at. You know, piles of buffalo bones moldering on the west, because there was a desire to eradicate the buffalo on the part of the federal government as a way of undermining indigenous communities that relied on the buffalo for survival. And it became a kind of systematic slaughter, frankly, to facilitate the railroads as well. And so there are photographs and paintings and magazine illustrations that show the monumental scale of this destruction, this near extermination. So it's in many ways a very sad story, but it is another example of artists taking the lead in a kind of awakening environmental consciousness. And it's through their efforts and through the efforts of William T. Hornaday, who was a scientist at the Smithsonian, that legislation was finally passed in the late 1880s to halt the extermination of the buffalo and to create protected sanctuaries for them, one of which was Yellowstone. And another part of that whole story, though, again, is the importance of the species to indigenous people and the extraordinary art that indigenous people made with buffalo and about buffalo, and not only in the past, but to this day. And indigenous people in the West are now taking the lead in fostering these slowly regrowing populations of animals. Some of the works of art that I'm talking about, some of which are too sacred, by the way, to have included in the exhibition, like ghost dance dresses made out of buffalo hide. But they're remarkable robes made of buffalo hide by Western Plains indigenous people that are meticulously ornamented and sometimes in the most dire circumstances, like at the Standing Rock Reservation, where people are literally imprisoned on a reservation, and they're making works of art about and out of buffalo as a way of maintaining their sense of cultural identity. It's a remarkable story of resilience as well as near extinction.
Absolutely. I think there's one final area I want to talk about before we end, and that is this amazing project that the federal government funded in the 1930s. It was the documentation of what was happening in rural America during the Great Depression, and of course compounded and overlaid on top of that became the disintegration of farm life, particularly in the mid and far west, and the amazing group of photographers who became part of Stryker's expeditionary force that went out and documented rural America. And of course we have what I consider to be one of the, sadly, one of the most beautiful photographs ever created, because the artistic sensibility that is just embedded in this from an abstract perspective in this photograph by Dorothea Lange is unbelievable. But the bleakness of the message can't really be overstated. And so, her documentation deeply with migrants and watching this evolution of people who had not that long ago come out to these farms and now were quickly abandoning and mostly moving west to California, really sort of important impacts. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about how that activism may be largely orchestrated by Stryker, their leader at the Farm Security Administration, but how these artists help to, and I think this is beyond documentary work. This is, and many of them really do, push deeply into the artistic realm, and Stryker had a great eye for all of it, and he knew how to make a point, and he helped them all learn. But maybe you could just talk a little bit about how they impacted the conversation.
Well, first of all, just imagine a federal government that's actually going to work to save the environment and to help poor people. That's what the New Deal was about in many ways. It had problems, it had limitations. There are charges of kind of racial bias and other things regarding that movement, but still, it's a remarkable moment in American history and a remarkable example of how government can at least try to help improve people's lives. And the fact that that include a very deliberate environmental program is significant. Some of you may have heard of the Civilian Conservation Corps, a group of sort of quasi-soldiers who were rebuilding farms and the land and using sustainable farming practices and encouraging healthier relationships with the environment. The artists were part of this. They weren't necessarily part of the Civilian Conservation Corps, but they were part of this nationwide New Deal effort to document the truth of what was happening. And they did so with an artist's eye, but not to kind of distort or lie, but to rather, I would say, condense the truth into the most meaningful nuggets of visual information you could imagine. Lange was a master at this. The way that this tractored out image kind of, as I've tried to suggest, condenses the story of mechanized industrial agriculture and the droughts of the Western Plains into a single image with its abstract forms capturing our eye and bringing it to look at that empty house on the horizon. There's a lot of kind of social and environmental meaning packed into this rather austere and economic image. I think that Lange stands out, but you're right, there were many different photographers who were involved with this. Walker Evans was traveling throughout the South, documenting poverty in Alabama and Mississippi and elsewhere. And many of these people were well-trained artist photographers who had their own kind of artistic ambitions as gallery artists, but when the government called, they gave service, and they did so in remarkable ways. We often see Lang's photographs, framed and displayed on the walls of an art museum, but it's important to remember that they were part of an enormous archive. And the archive consisted of these cards of information with the image and then handwritten notes that the photographer would make about the people she had met and where and what were the exact conditions. And all of those cards are still in the Department of Agriculture archive, actually at the Library of Congress now. But they tell a really interesting story about a kind of bureaucracy of government aid. And the fact that photography was part of that, I think, says something about the power of art.
And I think some of you may have remembered the exhibition we did during our construction project at the Stryker Center, where we delved into those archives at the Library of Congress and presented by a range of photographers and artists who work with the Farm Security Administration some of the great photographs that are now in the public realm that were produced by that team of artists. So Alan, I want to thank you for being here tonight to discuss your amazing book and reflect upon your amazing exhibition, and also to thank you for being at that space, that intersecting point where environmentalism and art and conservation and concern about the ecology all are coming together, and for your own role in creating this realm of what I think you're terming eco-criticism. And so I invite you all to digest the book, to investigate the book, to learn more about what Professor Braddock has talked about tonight, and we hope to see you at some of the upcoming features we have in the continuing saga that we're telling this fall about that intersection of environmentalism and art. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.